This isn't about oil. I know that's the easy answer. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than anyone. And yes, American companies would love access to that oil. But if this were really about oil, the story would be different. Trump could have taken the deal. Because here's what nobody's talking about. Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela's president, the man Trump calls a narco-terrorist and a dictator, offered Trump exactly what he wanted: access to Venezuelan oil, access to mining rights, a business deal that would make American corporations billions. And Trump said no. Not because the deal was bad, because the politics were wrong. So if it's not about oil, what is it about? To understand what's happening in Venezuela right now, you have to understand what happened in Panama 36 years ago. Because Trump isn't creating a new strategy. He's copying an old one, a strategy that worked perfectly for George H.W. Bush in 1989, a strategy that turned a president with a branding problem into a war hero, a strategy that relied on one simple formula: find a small country with a leader the American public can hate, claim he's a threat to national security, invade quickly, capture the leader, declare victory, watch your approval ratings soar. Bush did it in Panama. Trump wants to do it in Venezuela. But there's one problem. Venezuela isn't Panama. Not even close. And the gamble Trump is taking right now could turn into the biggest foreign policy disaster since Iraq. Maybe worse. Because if this goes wrong, if the invasion turns into an occupation, if Venezuela becomes a guerrilla war that drags on for years, it won't just destroy Trump's presidency. It will destabilize an entire continent. So let me show you why this is happening. What the real motivations are. Why drugs are just the cover story. And why the Panama Playbook might not work this time. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand the psychology and the politics, everything that's about to happen makes perfect sense. Let's start in October 1987. Newsweek magazine publishes a cover story that becomes one of the most infamous political hit pieces in American history. The headline reads, "Bush battles the wimp factor." The article is brutal. It portrays George Bush, the sitting vice president of the United States, as weak, effeminate, indecisive. A man with an impressive resume, but no backbone. Bush had been a congressman, UN ambassador, CIA director, vice president under Ronald Reagan for 8 years. On paper, he was one of the most qualified presidential candidates in modern history. But the American public didn't see a leader. They saw a bureaucrat, a manager, someone who followed orders but couldn't give them. The article quoted political strategists who said Bush had a fundamental problem. He lacked machismo. He wasn't tough enough for the presidency. One anonymous Republican source said Bush needed to hire a female ambassador just to inject some testosterone into his campaign. The implication was clear. Bush was too soft to be commander-in-chief. And this wasn't just one article. This was the narrative. Late-night comedians mocked him. Political cartoons depicted him as timid and awkward. Even his own party doubted him. Reagan had been a cowboy. Strong, confident, unapologetically American. Bush came across as a Connecticut blue blood who wore sweater vests and spoke in careful, measured tones. He won the 1988 election, but the wimp label stuck. And here's the thing about political branding. It doesn't go away just because you win. Bush entered the White House in January 1989 knowing he had to prove himself. He had to show the American people, show his own party, show the world that he was decisive, that he was strong, that he could use military force without hesitation. He needed a win. A quick, clean, decisive military victory that would silence the critics and cement his legacy as a strong leader. He just needed the right target. And he found one in Panama. Panama in 1989 was the perfect punching bag. It's a small country, narrow strip of land connecting Central and South America, population of about 2 million. Strategically important because of the Panama Canal, which the U.S. had controlled since 1903. By 1989, the canal was still critical for global shipping, and the U.S. had military bases throughout the country. American troops were already there. American infrastructure was already in place. And the leader of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, had become a problem. Noriega was a military dictator. He'd seized power through a coup. He rigged elections. He suppressed opposition. He was involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, and arms dealing. And crucially, he'd been useful to the United States for years. The CIA had been paying Noriega since the 1960s. When George H.W. Bush was CIA director in the 1970s, Noriega was on the payroll. He provided intelligence. He helped the U.S. fight communist movements in Central America. He allowed the U.S. to use Panama as a staging ground for operations throughout the region. He was America's guy. But by the late 1980s, Noriega was becoming a liability. He was too visible, too corrupt, too independent. American newspapers were running stories about his drug connections. Human rights organizations were documenting his abuses. And he was starting to make moves that threatened U.S. interests. In 1987, he survived a coup attempt and cracked down even harder on opposition. In 1988, the U.S. tried to pressure him to resign, offering to drop drug trafficking charges if he'd step down. He refused. In 1989, he annulled an election he'd clearly lost and installed a puppet government. The situation was deteriorating, and Bush saw an opportunity. The justification came in December 1989. On December 16th, 4 off-duty U.S. military officers were driving through Panama City when they ran a checkpoint manned by Noriega's forces. Panamanian soldiers opened fire, killing Marine Lieutenant Robert Paz. Another U.S. officer was detained and beaten. His wife was threatened. The incident gave Bush the pretext he needed. He could claim American lives were in danger. He could argue that Noriega was out of control, and he could frame military intervention as defending American citizens abroad. 3 days later, on December 20th, 1989, Bush launched Operation Just Cause. 24,000 American troops invaded Panama. The operation was overwhelming. U.S. forces had air superiority, better training, better equipment, and complete intelligence dominance. The Panamanian Defense Forces, Noriega's military, numbered about 12,000. They were poorly equipped and disorganized. The invasion was over in a matter of days. By January 3rd, Noriega had surrendered. He took refuge in the Vatican embassy, but psychological warfare, including blasting rock music at the building 24 hours a day, broke him down. He surrendered to U.S. forces and was immediately flown to Miami, where he was arrested on drug trafficking charges. Bush presented 4 official reasons for the invasion: protecting the lives of American citizens in Panama, defending democracy and human rights, combating drug trafficking, and safeguarding the integrity of the Panama Canal treaties. All 4 reasons sounded noble, and all 4 were largely fabricated. The claim about protecting American lives was based on one incident, the shooting of Lieutenant Paz, which happened 3 days before the invasion. There's strong evidence that U.S. forces deliberately provoked that confrontation to create a justification for war. The democracy and human rights argument was pure hypocrisy. The U.S. had supported Noriega for decades while he rigged elections and murdered opposition leaders. In 1984, when Noriega stole an election, the Reagan-Bush administration endorsed the results. They only cared about democracy when it was politically convenient. The drug trafficking justification was the most absurd. Yes, Noriega was involved in drugs. He helped Colombian cartels launder money and move cocaine through Panama. But he was doing this with the knowledge and tacit approval of U.S. intelligence agencies. The CIA had used Noriega's drug connections to fund anti-communist operations in Central America. When Bush was CIA director, he personally worked with Noriega. The idea that Bush suddenly discovered Noriega was a drug dealer in 1989 is laughable. The real reason for the invasion wasn't any of these official justifications. The real reason was regime change. Bush wanted Noriega out because Noriega was no longer controllable. And Bush wanted a military victory to prove he wasn't weak. The invasion worked perfectly. American casualties were light. 23 U.S. soldiers killed. Panamanian casualties were much higher. Estimates range from 500 to 3,000 dead, including many civilians. But the American media didn't focus on that. They focused on the victory. Noriega in handcuffs. American troops parading through Panama City. Bush looking decisive and strong. The wimp factor disappeared overnight. Bush's approval rating, which had been hovering around 51%, shot up to nearly 80%. It was the highest approval rating of his presidency, and it came from a war that lasted 2 weeks. Noriega was convicted in a U.S. court and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. He served 17 years before being extradited to France on money laundering charges, then returned to Panama, where he died in 2017. The legal precedent was staggering. The United States had invaded a sovereign nation, kidnapped its head of state, and tried him in an American court for crimes committed in his own country. It was the first time in modern history that the U.S. had done this, and it worked. No international backlash, no prolonged occupation, no guerrilla resistance, just a quick, clean regime change that made Bush look like a war hero. This is the model. This is the Panama Playbook. And this is exactly what Trump wants to replicate in Venezuela. But to understand why Trump thinks he can do this, we have to understand the parallels. Like Bush in 1989, Trump in 2025 has a branding problem. Not the wimp factor, but something arguably worse: scandal fatigue. Trump has been embroiled in controversy since before he took office. The Epstein documents, classified files at Mar-a-Lago, multiple indictments, January 6th. Every week brings a new headline, a new lawsuit, a new crisis. And while Trump's base remains loyal, the broader American public is exhausted. His approval ratings have been underwater for months. Trump knows the oldest trick in politics. When you're in trouble domestically, start a war. It's called the rally around the flag effect. When a country goes to war, approval ratings for the president almost always spike. It happened for Bush in Panama. It happened for his son in Afghanistan and Iraq. It happened for Bill Clinton during the Kosovo War. And Trump wants it to happen for him. But he needs the right target. He needs a villain the American public can hate, a leader who's easy to demonize, a country that won't put up too much of a fight. And he needs to frame it as something other than regime change. He needs a justification that sounds legitimate. That's where Venezuela comes in. Nicolás Maduro is the perfect villain. He's a socialist. He's authoritarian. His government has been accused of human rights abuses, rigged elections, and economic mismanagement. Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, is now in ruins. Hyperinflation has destroyed the currency. Millions have fled the country. Basic goods are scarce. Hospitals lack medicine. The infrastructure is collapsing. And Maduro is blamed for all of it. For the American right, Maduro represents everything they hate about socialism. For the American left, he represents authoritarian corruption. He's a leader almost everyone can agree to despise. And Trump has the perfect justification: drugs. Specifically, the fentanyl crisis. Over 100,000 Americans die every year from drug overdoses, most involving fentanyl. It's a genuine crisis. And Trump has spent years blaming foreign countries for it. First it was Mexico, then China. Now it's Venezuela. The Trump administration has labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist. They claim Venezuela is a hub for drug trafficking, that cartels operate freely under Maduro's protection, that Venezuelan cocaine and precursor chemicals are flooding into the United States. On February 14, 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced Operation Southern Spear, a military operation deploying U.S. naval and air assets to the Caribbean. The stated mission is counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group is positioned off Venezuela's coast. 15,000 troops are reportedly on standby. But here's the problem with the drug narrative. It's mostly false. Venezuela is not the primary source of drugs entering the United States. That's Mexico and Colombia. According to the DEA's own data, the vast majority of cocaine and fentanyl coming into the U.S. originates in Colombia and is trafficked through Mexico. Venezuela is involved in regional trafficking, but it's not a major player in the U.S. drug market. The fentanyl crisis is primarily driven by synthetic opioids manufactured in China and Mexico, not cocaine from Venezuela. So why is Trump targeting Venezuela? Because drugs are the cover story, just like they were in Panama. The real goal is regime change. Trump wants Maduro gone, and he's not alone. Marco Rubio, Trump's Secretary of State, has been pushing for regime change in Venezuela for years. Rubio is a hardline anti-communist who sees Maduro as an extension of Cuban influence in the hemisphere. He's argued that removing Maduro would weaken Cuba, weaken Russia's presence in Latin America, and send a message to China that the U.S. won't tolerate authoritarian regimes in its backyard. This is geopolitical chess. Maduro has allies. Russia provides military support. China has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure and oil. Iran has sold drones to Maduro's military. For Trump and Rubio, toppling Maduro isn't just about Venezuela. It's about pushing back against rival powers. But here's where the Panama Playbook breaks down, because Venezuela is not Panama, not even close. Panama in 1989 had a population of 2 million. Venezuela has 30 million. Panama is 29,000 square miles, mostly flat terrain. Venezuela is 353,000 square miles, more than twice the size of Iraq, with mountains, jungles, and urban centers. Panama's military numbered 12,000 poorly equipped soldiers. Venezuela has 123,000 active military personnel, plus 1.6 million militia members. Panama had no significant allies. Venezuela has Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba providing support. The U.S. had military bases in Panama before the invasion. The U.S. has no bases in Venezuela and would have to invade from neighboring Colombia or from the sea. And most importantly, Noriega had no popular support. When U.S. troops arrived in Panama City, much of the population celebrated. They were tired of Noriega. They saw the U.S. as liberators. Maduro, for all his failures, still has a base of support. Polls show he's deeply unpopular, but a foreign invasion would almost certainly rally Venezuelans around him. Even people who hate Maduro hate the idea of American occupation more. This is the nightmare scenario. The U.S. bombs Venezuelan military targets. Maduro doesn't fall. His government digs in. Caracas becomes a war zone. The Venezuelan military fragments, with some units defecting and others fighting. Militias mobilize. The country turns into an insurgency. One Venezuelan official, speaking anonymously to Reuters, admitted that Venezuela couldn't last 2 hours in a conventional war against the United States. But he also said that's not the plan. The plan is to avoid conventional war. The plan is to make Venezuela ungovernable, to turn it into a guerrilla war that bleeds American forces and destroys political support back home. Venezuela has been studying asymmetric warfare for years. They've studied Vietnam, they've studied Iraq, they've studied Afghanistan. They know they can't beat the U.S. military in open battle. But they also know the U.S. can't sustain a long-term occupation if casualties mount and public support collapses. Here's what that would look like. The U.S. launches airstrikes targeting military infrastructure, communications, and leadership. Maduro's government survives the initial assault and goes underground. Venezuelan special forces and militias launch hit-and-run attacks on U.S. positions, ambushes, improvised explosives, sniper fire, the kind of warfare that's impossible to defend against. Caracas, a city of 3 million, becomes a labyrinth of urban combat. Every neighborhood is a potential ambush. Every building could hide fighters. U.S. forces would have to clear the city block by block, and even then, insurgents would filter back in. Meanwhile, the civilian population suffers. Infrastructure is destroyed. Water, electricity, and food supplies are cut off. Refugees flood into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. Humanitarian organizations call it a crisis. International media broadcasts images of starving children in bombed hospitals. And back in the United States, the political cost mounts. American soldiers start coming home in body bags. At first, it's a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The war that was supposed to last 2 weeks drags into months, then years. The American public, which initially supported the operation, turns against it. Protests erupt. Congress demands withdrawal. But by then, it's too late. The U.S. has committed to propping up a new government, and that government can't survive without American military protection. This is the Iraq scenario. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, toppled Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks, and declared mission accomplished. Then the insurgency began. U.S. forces spent 8 years fighting a war they couldn't win. Over 4,000 American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. The war cost over $2 trillion. And when the U.S. finally withdrew, Iraq was more unstable than before the invasion. Trump himself has criticized the Iraq War as a disaster. He's called it a waste of lives and money. He's said the U.S. should never have invaded. And yet, the strategy he's pursuing in Venezuela follows the exact same pattern. Regime change based on false pretenses, with no plan for what comes after. So why is Trump willing to take this risk? Why gamble on a military intervention that could spiral into a disaster? Because the political upside is enormous if it works. If Maduro falls quickly, if Venezuela transitions to a pro-U.S. government, if Trump can stand on the deck of an aircraft carrier and declare victory, his approval ratings will soar. The scandals will fade into the background, the media will focus on his decisive leadership. Republicans will rally behind him, even Democrats will have a hard time criticizing a successful military operation, and Trump will have rewritten his legacy. He won't be remembered for January 6th or classified documents. He'll be remembered as the president who took down a dictator and restored American dominance in the hemisphere. But if it fails, if Venezuela becomes an occupation, if American soldiers die in a guerrilla war, Trump's presidency is finished. His approval ratings will collapse. The 2026 midterm elections will be a bloodbath for Republicans, impeachment will be back on the table, and Trump will be remembered as the president who dragged the U.S. into another unwinnable war. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Trump knows it. That's why he's hesitating. That's why, as of this recording, the order hasn't been given. Because once the bombs start falling, there's no turning back. China has invested over $50 billion in Venezuela. They're not going to let that investment disappear without a fight. Russia has military advisors in Venezuela right now. They've sold advanced weapon systems to Maduro's government. They're not going to abandon Venezuela without extracting a cost, and that cost will be paid in American blood. So here's where we are. The U.S. military is positioned for an invasion. Trump has the authority to launch it. The justification, drugs and terrorism, has been established. The target, Nicolás Maduro, has been demonized. The Panama Playbook is ready. The only question is whether Trump pulls the trigger. And there's one more factor Trump has to consider: international response. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, how will Russia and China react? They're not going to send troops. They're not going to fight the U.S. directly. But they will fund the resistance. They will provide intelligence, weapons, training, and financial support to anti-U.S. forces in Venezuela. Just like the Soviet Union did in Vietnam. Just like Iran did in Iraq. Asymmetric warfare is cheap. You don't need aircraft carriers or stealth bombers. You need insurgents willing to fight, and you need foreign powers willing to supply them. Russia and China would love nothing more than to see the U.S. military bogged down in South America, burning through resources, losing soldiers, and destroying its credibility. And the answer depends on one thing. Does Trump believe he can win quickly? Because if he thinks this will be Panama, a 2-week war with a victory parade, he'll do it. But if his military advisors are honest, if they tell him this could become Iraq or Vietnam, he might hesitate. The problem is, political pressure is mounting. Every day Trump delays, he looks weaker. The hawks in his administration are pushing for action. The media is questioning his resolve. And Trump's entire brand is built on being strong, on being decisive, on not backing down. The longer he waits, the harder it becomes to justify the buildup. If you position 15,000 troops and an aircraft carrier strike group and then do nothing, you look foolish. You look like you were bluffing. And Trump hates looking weak. So the invasion is coming. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but it's coming. And when it happens, when the bombs start falling on Caracas, when U.S. Marines land on Venezuelan beaches, when the world watches another American regime change operation unfold, we'll know whether Trump was right, whether Venezuela is Panama or Iraq, whether this is a quick victory or a generational disaster. And by the time we know the answer, it will be too late to change course. Because that's how these things work. Wars are easy to start and impossible to stop. And once the U.S. commits to regime change, once American soldiers are on the ground, once the costs start mounting, withdrawal becomes politically impossible. Even if the war is a disaster, even if it's obvious the strategy failed, the U.S. will stay. Because leaving means admitting defeat. And no American president wants to be the one who lost a war. So the occupation continues. The casualties mount, the costs spiral, and the American people watch another generation of soldiers sent to fight a war they didn't ask for, in a country they can't find on a map, for reasons that no longer make sense. This is what's happening right now. Not in the future. Right now. The pieces are in place. The justification is established. The political pressure is building. And Trump is running out of time to decide. So the question isn't whether the U.S. will invade Venezuela. The question is when. And the question after that is whether the American people will support it. Whether they'll believe the drug war narrative. Whether they'll rally around the flag like they did in Panama. Or whether they'll see through it like they eventually did in Iraq. Because this isn't about oil. And it's not really about drugs. It's about politics. It's about legacy. It's about a president who needs a win and a foreign policy establishment that believes regime change is the solution to every problem. Panama worked because it was small, weak, and isolated. Venezuela is none of those things. And if Trump doesn't understand that difference, if he commits to an invasion based on faulty assumptions and political desperation, the consequences will define his presidency and reshape American foreign policy for decades. The bombs could start falling tomorrow, or next week, or next month. But they're coming. And when they do, we'll all find out whether Trump's gamble pays off or whether Venezuela becomes the graveyard of his presidency. The countdown has already started, and there's no stopping it now.